Podcast. We discuss all things photo, video, and camera related. I'm Ben Lucas.
And I'm Stuart Marlantis.
And this is Photo Op. Hello. How are you doing today?
Doing well. I think we're going to talk about something fun today, aren't we?
Yeah, we have had a string of business and philosophy-ish and money and very tactical, kind of hands-on, in-the-dirt, grindy stuff. Today, we're going to talk about something real fun, gear. We're going to talk about lenses. We're going to talk about what should you buy? Let's talk about buying stuff and spending some of that money.
I think this was a listener question, actually, right?
It is. So I will start by saying I get a question all the time, and the question is, what lens should I buy? And I have a huge issue with that question. My huge issue with that question is I don't know you. I don't know your life. That's like asking me, what car should you buy? I don't know what's better for you, a pickup truck or a smart car. They are two very different cars for two very different people and lifestyles. So without having more information, I have no idea what to tell you. But one of those pieces of information that you can give me is the thing that you are actually trying to shoot. Mm-hmm. So one specific listener question I got was from Rachel. Rachel asked, what is your lens of choice for shooting weddings? So we are going to answer that. First off is weddings, but we picked kind of 10 genres of photography, and we are going to list our top choice if you could only buy one lens for that genre, and then if you can buy a second lens, a good runner-up. And we're gonna battle it out and give our opinions on these 10 different genres of photography. So the intro really quick. Our list is going to be weddings, portraits, street photography, sports photography, automotive photography, macro, wildlife, landscapes, astro, and architecture. So one caveat that I have for this list is that what I personally would shoot with is not necessarily going to be my advice for this list. So for weddings, I personally use a 70-200 and a 20 prime most of the day, and then the rest of my gear bag is just primes. If you are asking advice for you, that's because I can very quickly switch out my lenses. I have all my lenses on me at all times, and I know exactly what I can do with all of these lenses. If you are new enough that you have to ask the question, what lens should I get? Then my advice is for you at that level. If you've already been shooting cars for years and you have a style, these are the lenses that you use, awesome. But if you're asking the question, what lens should I get? I'm assuming you're near that beginner stage, so that's going to be the advice, if that makes sense.
Yep, definitely. Yeah, these are all, I think, generally our best take at for beginners or near beginners at a good starting point lens or lenses for all these different genres.
All right, so let's dive right into it. Without further ado, I do like doing further ado on all these episodes, don't I? Okay, weddings. What should you shoot a wedding with? If you could only have one lens, I shoot 90% of my shots with a 70-200, but I think if you could only have one lens, I would say 24-70, and then my second lens would be the 70-200.
I agree. I mean, the 70-200, you're kind of paying to be able to stay at a distance. The 24-70, you can get many similar shots. You just have to be closer in. You have to zoom with your feet, so to speak. So I think if you only had to do one, having that that wide range that you can't get with the 70-200 is probably where I would stick with as well. Yeah.
So when I'm shooting weddings, I shoot a ton of wide shots with my 70-200. I just stand back and I zoom out to 70 and I get that wide shot, but then I'm able to snap zoom really quickly into the 200 and get the shot I need. 24-70, you're going to have a lot harder time staying out of the couple's way and being an unobtrusive wedding photographer trying to get a tight shot at 70. You're going to have to get pretty close. but you are going to miss so much more of the wedding day, being in that crowded bridal suite while they're getting ready, this, the dancing, all these small intimate moments. You need to have that wider lens.
Yeah.
So I would say if you only have one, get the 24-70, and the other caveat with this list is obviously if you shoot a different brand, or I think, what's the Tamron version of this?
The Tamron is a 28-75. So when we say 24-70, we mean anything roughly in that range. It depends on your brand and your manufacturer of lens. Yeah.
So those are the two that I would go with.
And these are 35 mil equivalent.
Yes.
By the way, so if you're shooting on a crop or micro four thirds, or you're shooting on medium format, in which case, why are you here? You have enough money to buy all these lenses. These are what we're telling you today is equivalent to a 35 millimeter body.
Yes. Yeah. So even though I love prime lenses and my kit is decked out in prime lenses, that is not what I would recommend for a wedding, because when you're just starting out, you need to be very quickly and reliably be able to capture the moment. You can't be caught changing lenses. You can't be caught having the wrong one on and missing that moment. I am a huge proponent for zooming with your feet, but if you're a beginner shooting weddings, just get the zoom lens. Make sure you get the shot, and then get better at getting a better shot later, but by not missing it by having the wrong lens on. So that just kind of gives you the whole suite from 24 to 200. So that just covers all your bases.
Yeah, for sure. Although, if you are going to shoot primes, the next two categories we have are very prime focused. Starting with Portraiture.
So portraits. The very first lens that everybody gets is a 50 mil. I don't like a 50 mil. I don't. I think 50 mils are great if you have a crop sensor. If you have an ASPC. The reason why I say that is because it will crop to 85. But if you upgrade your camera to a full frame 35 mil sensor and you're still shooting 50 with that same depth of field, you're getting that bubble head effect where their nose is really big and it's just a little too close in, too distorted. So I would shoot at 85. I love primes. I love having that big depth of field. 50 is just too close.
Nifty 50s are cheap and cheerful, and that's kind of, I think, your second choice for portraiture, especially on a full frame sensor. But really, where you need to be for portraiture is an 85. So if you're going to pick one 85, if you can't afford an 85, or if you have a 50 and that's just where you are for now, 50s will do the job, but they'll do a much better job on either a crop sensor, or they'll certainly be overtaken by an 85 on any full frame.
Yeah, I think what I would use the 50 for, if those were the only two lenses I had for portraits, are either when I'm trying to do more environmental stuff, so I want to get a little bit wider and show, like, hey, this is a business person in an office. Or this is a rancher on their farm, and get a little more sky and clouds and stuff like that. 50 is also, if you go like this, that 50 is what your eye sees, more or less. You kind of see at that, maybe a little bit wider. So some people say that 35 is actually closer, but 50 is generally your perspective and your point of view. So the other thing that I really like it for is I shoot 99% of my boudoir with a 50 mil. One, usually I am shooting at their home so that we can use their bedroom, so the photos are intimate to them, which means that it's usually small and cramped, and I couldn't get away with an 85. But also a little bit of that wide angles distortion makes it feel like your field of view, so the photos feel more intimate because it makes you feel like you're there and very close in the personal space of that person. Versus shooting that for like a business headshot of like, no, I'm too close. Back me up a little bit. Which is why I like the 85 better generally.
Yeah. Street photography. So this one is a little bit, I think, has a little bit more variance in in opinions industry wide. For me personally, I think the 35 is where you should at least start in street photography.
I can see that.
Reason being is it's not so ultra wide that things are super distorted. It still kind of approaches the compression of
Your
something
field of
closer
view.
to portraits,
Yeah.
or your field of view at the very least. But it's wide enough that if you're shooting in the street, if you're trying to catch a moment, it gives you that extra wiggle room in the frame to catch that when something a little bit closer in, like a 50, might miss the shot. So that's kind of my idea behind a 35. It's also wide enough that you can get away with shooting a grade or field of view in the frame, like more of a building, maybe not an entire building at 35, but more of the environment along with a subject. So it's a pretty, I personally really like 35 mils. I think it's a really fun, really versatile place to be at in lenses. And so I think for street, that's probably where I would go.
I generally agree with that advice. Having something small, compact, prime makes you less obtrusive while you're doing street, as well as having something that is closer to that point of view. My favorite street photographer is actually Jay Maisel. And I know that he likes shooting with these very long lenses with incredibly high shutter speeds, so he can really stop all of that action. So I think he uses like a 70 to 300 just all in one. So 70 is his wide, and 300 he can really get those interesting details, which I think where 35 mil fails in street photography is its wide angle, so it shows you everything and it lacks focus.
Yeah.
Where a lot of street photographers, I think the biggest problem that street photographers have is a lack of subject in their photography. What are you taking a photo of? Well, I thought it was interesting. What's interesting about it? Who's the main subject? What's the main subject? Some people do that really, really well, but I think when you're starting out, it's difficult to isolate the interesting part of a scene, where kind of standing back and using those more telephoto lenses can help with that. So, yeah, I think a 35... 50 maybe, but like getting a 70 to 300 really helps you isolate the interesting parts, and it also, if you find it interesting seeing it, it makes you wait for that moment.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, this like I said right at the beginning, street has such a variance of style and even philosophy around it, that this will really, you'll probably find what you want to shoot or your style of street really quickly. But if you're starting from nothing, I would tend to start wider and then really quickly start exploring other options. Maybe you're buying, like, let's say not a 70-300, maybe you're buying a 70-200 for other reasons. You might just pop that on your camera and try shooting street photography with it and see how that feels to you, if that longer range is helpful for your photography there. So definitely with street, experiment a lot. There are almost no real right answers.
Yeah, I think 35 is a good place to start, but I think kind of differing opinions on what the lens number 2 should be.
For sure.
It's something that I don't shoot very often. Something else I don't shoot very often, sports.
Sports. I mean, this is all about zoom, pretty much. Like
So
can you get to it?
So I have a 70-200, and the issue with that and shooting sports is 200 literally is just not long enough.
Yeah.
So if you already own one, maybe getting a teleconverter. But if you're like, hey, what lens should I get? Well, if you're a doctor or a lawyer, again, why are you listening to this show? I feel flattered. But like a 200 to 400 zoom. Like that is your king of sports lens. If that's too expensive, maybe like a 300 millimeter zoom, 400 if you really want to get a little bit tighter. But yeah, that's definitely where you start, because you're trying to get way down there. Lens number 2, I think, would be something on the wide end. So that you can get all the stadiums, you can get, the referee who is right next to you, or the ball that gets thrown right next to you,
or the team
where that
coming out on the
400
field
can't do it. Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, those kind of moments of the crowd, the team not in play, that would be a wider zoom would be perfect for that.
Yeah, the victory celebration when you're
Yeah, that
holding
kind
the
of stuff.
camera above your head type thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I love my 20 mil, but I think something like 2470, so that you can get in a little bit closer if you need to on those wide angle areas would be good.
Yeah, for sure. Something that I also basically never shoot, automotive.
Why are we talking about all these things we never shoot?
Because we did the research for our listeners. That's why. To be fair, I've actually shot street and sports. I just don't make a habit of doing it nowadays.
Yeah, I've shot for Ferrari and Mercedes. I wouldn't call myself a car photographer, though.
Yeah. So automotive.
Long stories on both of those.
Oh, boy. I think similarly with automotive, you're starting with a wider zoom. If you're starting from nothing, you're going to want a little bit more flexibility in what you're shooting. You're going to want to get, close but really wide. You're going to want to be able to stand back and get a little bit more compression on the narrower end. So I think that kind of wider but really more like medium range 24 to 70-ish zoom is probably where you should start with automotive.
Yeah, I would actually almost disagree with you. I don't actually think wider is better for cars. If you get too wide and you're not really seeing the car, I think all of my favorite car photography shots are shot more telephoto. But if I were to actually look up what lens was used, it's probably, closer to that 50 to 70 type range where it's more eye perspective, which is telephoto-ish for most people think, oh, I have to use my 20 or my 24. But I think really zooming in on those details, my favorite car photography is not actually showing the whole car, but it is showing like the logo or the headlight or, those moments that kind of emote from a car, if that makes sense. So you don't get that with a 24.
No.
You get that by kind of narrowing in on those details.
Yeah. Or, as you say with details, you could go the macro direction with automotive. There's some really cool stuff. One that you see actually fairly frequently, but I still like, is like at night in the rain, you've got water, like a macro of water drops on a headlight, stuff like that, where it's kind of neon. It's very it has that kind of industrial feel, and that is pretty much all shot exclusively with macros. So there is certainly some options for macro in automotive photography.
Yeah. For further reading, if you're interested in automotive photography, definitely look up Tim Wallace. I honestly cannot name a second automotive photographer. He's just the best that I know of. He's the only one I know of, but he's real good. So, pretty much everything I know about cars, I learned from him. I'm not a car guy, so definitely check him out if that's a genre of photography. I know that he used to shoot with Hasselblad, but I'm sure he has some classes out there with 35 millimeter equivalents.
Yeah. And now the most self-explanatory category of this whole list, macro photography. What do you shoot with?
I'm pretty sure you shoot with a macro lens.
A macro lens.
Okay, so there are some lenses that say you can shoot macro and they are not macro lenses. So what is the technical definition of what makes a lens macro?
The technical definition, well, really it's a question of working distance and the amount of magnification on the lens. So the specifics of this don't really matter too much, but basically a true macro lens, you can work within a certain distance of the front element of the lens, ideally as close as you can get away with. And generally you're shooting for a 2-to-1 or greater level of magnification.
I think the definition of what makes a lens macro is 1-to-1 magnification or greater. But the thing is, there will be some lenses that are 1-to-2, which means not quite macro, that still market themselves as a macro lens. So So before you pull the trigger on a macro lens, definitely do a little bit research on what that magnification is, because there are some that are not true macro lenses. The other thing that you kind of hit on is minimum focus distance. If a lens has a minimum focus distance of 3 feet, generally chances are it is not a macro lens, even if it claims to be. So like I have tried to shoot small things with my 7200. It does not work. There's just way too much minimum focus distance there. I think once I forgot my macro lens on a shoot when really early on when I had to shoot weddings. And so I kind of made it work with a 50 mil, just getting as close as I could and then cropping in post a little bit. But it was not nearly the same.
Yeah. A true macro lens, again, after some research, is really where you need to be. 1-to-1, as you said, is kind of the baseline. But if you could shoot, if your budget allows for like a 2-to-1 or greater, that is really the ideal for macro. There are so many different macro options that it's hard to really pick one. I
the
personally
100 mil.
Yeah, 100 mil is like the standard.
That's like the standard. It gets you a very specific perspective, though.
Yeah,
it gets it's not like you're close to the object. It's like you're looking through a microscope and you're seeing the object very closely, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I can't wait someday to buy a wide angle macro.
I know what you're gonna say.
So there are a few different Laowa lenses. Laowa is an awesome company that just makes.
It's a weird company, but I love them so much.
They make stuff that nobody else makes. One of theirs is this like 20. I think it's a 24 mil probe lens, which is basically a wide angle weird macro. It looks like a stick that you just like attach to the end of your camera. That's really cool. They also have, I think it's a 50 mil wide angle macro, which is a little more of a traditional lens, but they make some really, really cool macro stuff. The wide angle macros are neat because you can get more of the environment around the subject. You still get that macro where you get that super high detail, magnification, but the wide angles really let you give some context to the subject. So
I think the
neat.
Kind of verbal example would be if you're shooting like a bee resting in a flower.
Yeah.
A 100 mil macro will show you that one flower, whereas a wide angle macro will focus on that flower but show you the field of flowers.
Yeah.
So even though you're very close to that one bee and the perspective will show you the one flower, you're going to see all the other flowers behind it. So it's just a very different look and a very different feel.
So macros, 100 mil, do some research. But if you really like that space in general, I would start looking at wide angle.
Laowa does a lot of stuff where they have some lenses too that aren't technically macros, but they have such a close focusing distance they might as well be.
That you can use them as macros. Yeah. This episode is not sponsored by Laowa, by the way. We just like Laowa's output.
Although Laowa, if you want to sponsor us, we really want that probe lens.
Yeah. Oh boy, please. I want that probe lens. So yeah, macro, there you go. Macro's a little bit of a weird one, a little bit self-explanatory, but there are some complications there that you should check out.
Definitely look into those tech specs before you pull the trigger on a macro lens. So if you're not shooting bees and you're shooting something quite a bit larger, wildlife photography.
Yeah, so this one's pretty fun. Pretty much with wildlife, it kind of follows sports. You could do, I tend to go in the direction of you should go with like a 100 to 400 instead of a 200 to 400. That gives you a little bit more room for stuff that's, you want to be a little bit wider, that you're a little bit physically closer to the subject. It really depends on what you're shooting. Like if you're shooting birds, you pretty much want the longest, fastest lens you can afford.
Like a 400 prime
so like
would be
a 400
great.
prime would be the way to go. For a beginner, I would say
that's expensive though.
That's expensive. I would say a 100 to 400 if you can pull it off. If you can't pull off that cost, then a 70 to 200 ideally with a teleconverter, but really a 200 is not enough. But a 7200 with a teleconverter will get you some pretty darn good results for your money. But really, you should try to go to a 100 to 400, 200 to 400, or a 400 prime. That's really the way to go. But yeah, wildlife, like sports, as long and as fast as you can realistically afford, it will take all your money to shoot
the
wildlife.
only wildlife photography I shoot, and I say this jokingly, are proposals. where I set up in my hideout, and I'm just waiting for nature to take its course. No, but I for that, because I don't shoot wildlife, but I do a fair number of these surprise proposals. Because I already had the lenses, it was much cheaper and much easier for me to buy a teleconverter for my 7200, which now turns it into a 140 to 400. And I can get some surprisingly good photos out of that. The one caveat with getting a teleconverter versus a real lens is you're losing a little bit of that quality. It makes it a little bit fuzzier. I will say that the quality is still better than getting a 70 to 200 and cropping it. Because I'd much rather have it be a little bit fuzzy rather than a little bit pixelated.
Agreed.
It's just so much better to have an image that's like slightly soft than like, oh, this image has been cropped and killed by Facebook compression type look.
Cropping is never a replacement for even the cheaper end of adding glass, which is a teleconverter.
I do have a lens that I kind of bought as a joke because it was on sale for I think like $20. Can you guess what lens?
I can guess, but I think it's probably a mirror lens.
Yes, it is a mirror lens. So if you're not familiar with mirror lenses, they look super freaking weird. They are fixed aperture. You cannot change it. They are fixed focal length. You cannot change that. So it's, I think, a 500 millimeter f8 mirror lens, and it's got this dot in the center of the lens just because the optics kind of like go around it. It's just a very weird construction, but it's cheap construction. They work.
Yeah, they work kind of like telescopes. They're manufactured in a very similar way. They're cheap, but they work. They make really weird bokeh. Like it turns into like little donuts almost. But
it does. It is odd looking. I did a test on the street signs across the street with it, where I took my 70 to 200 and then cropped it in post, and then I took my 500 mil and cropped it in post, and they were nearly identical when I cropped my 70 to 200 to my 500, because the quality was just that bad that even cropping it that much gave me an almost identical image quality. So I bought it like for funsies, and I think I brought it with me to like one baseball game once upon a time because I could sneak that one in past security, where a full 70 to 200 I can't. It's also like a third of the size. It's a real small lens. So I mean, they're fun and they're crazy cheap. I think you can buy one brand new for like $100 or something like that. They're not expensive cheap lenses. They're not good either, but I mean, if you need that distance and if you're a beginner, or if you're a parent who's buying this for your kid, so you don't know how serious they are about it and you don't have a lot to invest yet, you can still like get them this lens and they can learn on it.
Yeah,
so that's not a bad route to go. It's a very inexpensive route to go.
Yeah, they also are universally manual lenses. So that's another thing is if you're shooting wildlife, sometimes you'll want that autofocus, and a mirror lens will not give you autofocus.
Nope.
That being said, they're like I said with Nifty 50s, they're cheap.
They're
and
like
cheerful.
a couple bucks.
Yeah, they're fun. But really, the budget option should be no lower than I think a 70 to 200 and a teleconverter.
I agree wholeheartedly. I say the mirror lens is like a joke because I own one. Which again, if you're a student or if you've got, it's like the cost of like a high-end dinner. Like what other lens can you get for that cheap? You can't. Except a cheap Nifty 50.
Yeah.
I will say, though, that when I upgraded my Nifty 50 from the cheap plastic 1.8 to the better constructed 1.4, it felt better to use. The autofocus was way snappier, and the images were, like, marginally better. They weren't so much better that I would say, like, oh, absolutely. But, like, it just quality of life with that lens was just better.
For sure. The opposite end of the spectrum, landscapes.
Oh, we talked about shooting long. Now
Yeah.
landscapes, we're shooting wide.
Yeah, landscapes. I mean, it's a story of what wide zoom is available in your particular body or manufacturer of choice that you like. Get that one. So, in my case, it's like I have a Tamron 17 to 28 for Sony that I really like. That's perfect for landscapes. It's pretty fast at 2.8. You can get primes that are super wide that are plenty fast.
Yeah, the Canon one in that range would be the 1635, I believe.
1635, yeah.
They also have a 17 to 40 that costs a little bit less because I think that one's f4 instead of 2.8.
Yeah.
I actually had a giant honkin' Sigma lens that was the equivalent of that, but the thing is, it was so front heavy and ridiculous. I never wanted to carry it with me to any of my shoots. It took up too much space in my bag. It had this giant bulbous front element that I couldn't properly put a lens cap on that was prone to getting scratched or damaged. So I actually I went to Iceland and rented a 20 mil because I'm like, no way am I bringing that. And as soon as I got back from Iceland, I said, at no point in time did I I lost a few millimeters on the wide end of the spectrum, but at no time did I feel, oh darn, I wish I could zoom in a little bit. So I just sold that wide angle one and just went and that's the one that I have now. So my wide angle is a 20 prime. It's super cheap. It's super small. It's just easy to use and carry versus what those zoom lenses are going to give you really big front elements.
Yeah, although I'll say the 70 and 28 is not too bad. It is hefty, but it's not terrible. Primes are going to be way smaller, way easier to pack up a mountain.
I exaggerate a little bit, but the 1635 was like the size of my head. It's it's huge.
So wide.
But yeah, it also
zooms,
depends. Like,
primes.
is your landscape like you drive up to a public park and shoot landscapes, or you go out backpacking and now you're at the top of a mountain and shoot a landscape?
Yeah, every pound matters then. Yeah, for sure.
So whatever wide prime, but if you could get a second lens for landscape, I would actually advise like an 85. So if you see there is something beautiful about getting that kind of compression, I almost want to say 50, but I like having something that is slightly more compressed and more condensed than your eye view because it feels more artistic or cinematic. So if you get like that mountain and kind of all these mountains with like a path just kind of going up type of thing, something that is not showing all of the brush and garbage and everything. You just find this one interesting element of a landscape. I love that, and it's very hard to isolate a single element with a wide.
Yeah, a lot of people don't look at telephoto lenses or portrait lenses like an 85 for a long time, if ever, in landscape photography, and I think that's a shame because there are so many cool photos, cool opportunities in landscapes in that range. It's not all about wide. I mean, sure, if you're starting out, you should probably start wide, but you should really quickly start looking at something a little bit more telephoto. If you've probably got a nifty 50, maybe start with that, but 85 is super cool and underrated, I think, as a landscape lens.
I think for literally any of the topics that we're talking about today, if you already have a camera and a couple lenses and you're asking what lens should I get next, my answer is going to be something more telephoto than you have now. I think the problem that a lot of beginner photographers have is they shoot too wide. Like if they have a that 24 to 70, they stay on the 24 end and they forget to zoom in to the 70 end. Unless like they need the distance, in which case if you need the distance, maybe you should be walking closer to the subject. Or conversely, actually, you should be walking away from the subject and zooming in and getting more of that compression. Because a good photography is not necessarily about what's in the frame, but it's also about what you choose to leave out of the frame.
Definitely.
They can't see you nodding on the podcast.
Yeah. That's true. Bad for audio. I think you're exactly right. Going any telephoto from where you are as a beginner is the way to go.
Just super generic advice regardless, but yeah.
Unless you're starting telephoto for some bizarre reason. I've never heard of anybody who's done
Most
that.
people don't start there, yeah.
Telephoto's
kit
scary.
lenses don't start at 300. That's not...
No. Something else a little bit on the wide end, astrophotography. So this one,
I have zero experience with, so take it away. I have no idea. I know there's a lot of like scientific calculation about like how fast the stars move and ISO and stuff like that, but I've never really got into it.
Yeah, so Astro is something I've done a little bit of. Basically, you want to shoot just about as wide as you can possibly get away with. I mean, this pretty much stays that way no matter what you're doing. You're going to want to stay wide. So as close as you can get to 15 millimeters ish would be the ideal for astrophotography. I will say though that I have I think it's a 14 millimeter prime. That's a pretty decent little prime, but I actually shoot now all of my Astro stuff with the 17 to 28 Tamron. It's just fast enough and wide enough. I don't really care about that extra 2 millimeters. So you want
generally, if you're trying to save money, looking at primes, because a prime is going to save you money over an equivalently wide zoom.
Yeah, the prime was way cheaper. So I got the 14 mil prime first, and that was a fraction of what the 17 to 28 was.
The other thing that primes do is, like, I have a 20 prime, but it opens much farther than a 17 to 40 would.
Yeah, primes certainly. If you're starting out, you're trying to save money, get a prime. Oh, and get manual. For Astro, autofocus basically doesn't matter / hurts you more than it would ever help. So even if you have an autofocus lens, when you're shooting Astro, you turn it off anyway. So don't bother buying a lens. Like if it's a manual prime lens and you're shooting Astro, just go for it. It doesn't matter.
And if you know you're going to be shooting a lot of Astro, you can save a lot of money by buying an older lens that is manual that's still a high-quality lens. Oh, yeah. Just it's missing the feature of, like, image stabilization and autofocus, which you don't need anyway.
Yeah. And for Astro, really, the thing that matters is, one, that it's wide, and two, that it's as fast as you can possibly afford. So I wouldn't shoot Astro with really anything under
less than like a 2.8.
Yeah, like a 2.8 at the worst. Anything wider than that, anything faster than that is better. That's pretty much how it goes with Astro. As far as like how long you should expose your frame for, all that kind of stuff, you're just gonna have to look up a calculator. There are, depending on your particular length of the lens that you're using, there are different calculations. Just look it up. There's lots of calculators out there that are super easy to tell you exactly how long you should expose for without getting any star trails, unless you want star trails.
Yes.
So look all that stuff up, but pretty much wide, as fast as you can afford. That's Astro.
That's if you want to see the whole galaxy and all the little dots. Otherwise, if you want them to smear in those kind of like motion type, more artsy, less scientific, if you will.
Yeah, then you can expose for as long as you want.
Architecture. And I would say architecture comes in two forms. There is like real estate photography, which is I'm in this room and I need to show off the room. And then there is like building photography where like you're outside looking at this thing. And of course you do both in that same thing. But I would have different recommendations for the two different lenses. I think my first recommendation is no matter what, make sure it's rectilinear. So when you go really wide, there's on one end of the extreme fisheye, but then there are lenses that they're not fisheye, but if they're not rectilinear, they will bow a little bit. So all of your straight lines curve at the edges. And you definitely don't want that for architecture. It will distort your image. So rectilinear just means that it will look a little bit goofy. Of a foot will, stretch out half the frame once you start getting to the corners, but they'll stay as straight lines.
Yeah, hugely important. So, yeah, rectilinear anything, that is a must. I don't think you could... you can correct... I will say, like, if you're on a super tight budget and you've got something wide that isn't rectilinear, that gets distorted, you can correct for that to some degree in Lightroom and Photoshop.
You correct, you de-sphere,
but
and then you crop in all of your lost edges. But
it's gonna look
then you're also
janky.
zooming in on that, which is probably something else that you're not looking to do.
Yeah.
So yeah, architecture, super wide, 1635 is going to be pretty good for you. The other thing that I would say is tilt shift. So tilt shifts are specifically meant for this. They are meant for perspective control. So if you're not used to shooting with the tilt shift, when you stand outside a tall skyscraper and you look up and at the base it's super, super wide, and as you look up it turns into a tiny little needle. Well, a tilt shift will kind of unbow that. So it doesn't look like it's coming to a point. It looks like it's staying straight up. If you're shooting real estate photography, a lot of people don't get tilt shifts because they are quite pricey, but make sure that you fix that in post so the room doesn't look like it's falling in on you. It just kind of gives this weird uneasy feelings when your verticals aren't straight lines. But if you are doing just architecture photography and you're asking what lens should I buy, tilt shift. Get a tilt shift.
Yeah, tilt shifts aren't only for making things look like toys, although that's a particularly popular use.
That is what a lot of people use for them. Yeah.
Yeah, they're really their real ability. You get to see the best in architecture.
Is perspective control.
Yeah,
yes.
You get to control that perspective and make everything look correct and remove a lot of that perspective that would normally exist. It's a really interesting look, and it's something that I feel like almost is like if you use a tilt shift lens right for that kind of use, many people don't even notice. Like
yes.
it looks so natural that you kind of, unless you were looking at the same, the photo with perspective distortion and without, you wouldn't necessarily see what actually was done. So that's kind of the beauty of tilt shift. Is it's one of those things where if you did your job right, nobody will notice, and that's why you pay tons and tons of money for a tilt shift lens. It's a very cool option.
I'm gonna throw in a we have hit the end of our list, but I'm gonna throw in a bonus use for tilt shifts. A lot of product photographers I know use tilt shifts. So product photography is not one of the genres that we've talked about because there can be small tabletop, there can be clothing, there's all, I would lump clothing in more with the portraits and use those lens choices. I would lump the tabletop in more with the macro and use those lens choices. But when you're shooting, bottles or things that have angles, a lot of the work that I did for Intel and Nintendo, though they have these kind of boxy things with straight lines, and you don't want any of that kind of caving in on itself. You want those straight lines to look straight. So a lot of the product photographers that I know shoot tilt shift for the same reason that you would do it with a building. You want all of your lines to look the way that they were actually designed, and you don't want the kind of odd perspective that shooting with a camera gives you.
Yeah, definitely. So that, I think, with a special bonus category, sums up all of our different genres of photography and the lenses that we think you should start out with if you're going to work in that space. As always, this depends on your style and the kind of things that you shoot. But if you're a beginner, I think this is a good place to get you started. You should always do research, and it's actually a good idea, I think, to find somebody find a street photographer, find an automotive photographer, find somebody that's doing work that you in a style that you think is really cool, that you want to emulate or learn, and see what they shoot with and go from there. But I think this is a good starting point for all of these different categories.
Absolutely. The other thing last thing I would say is if you own a lens and it is the wrong lens, it doesn't mean you can't shoot that. Try it. If you own a 50, don't think you have to go out and buy a lens before you start shooting portraits of people. Start shooting portraits. And then when you are at a point where your taste has now gotten this high, we've talked about this before, then you're like, you know what? I really hate the kind of perspective that I'm getting. I need that closer up telephoto lens. So there will be times where you have a kit right now. That's the reason you're listening to this podcast. That's the reason that you are asking these questions. You have something. Start with the thing you own. And then if you need something, go ahead and look at these recommendations. But yeah, give it a shot.
Yeah,
I mean, I've shot wide-angle portraits. I've shot telephoto landscapes. It works.
And who knows, you might come up with a cool style using your incorrect lens that you wouldn't have come up with at all if you'd had the so-called correct one. So definitely experiment. There are no real right answers with any of this stuff. There's a lot of space for experimentation and trying new things here. So these are kind of a general guide, but feel free to break the rules a little bit. Try with so-called substandard choices and see what you get.
I think these are the rules, and once you've learned the rules, feel free to break them.
Yeah.
If you have no idea where to start with this, and these work for a reason. And then once you've gotten into that and you want to use your creativity and use a different lens, knock yourself out. Do it.
Awesome.
So I hope you guys enjoyed a little bit of this gear baiting episode where we talk about new lenses and what you should shoot for all these different genres of photography. I love that we actually got some questions for this one. So if you have a question, we would love to answer it. We can turn it into a whole episode. You can shoot us some info, and I don't know what we're talking about next time, but I'm sure we'll be answering one of your questions.
Yeah, we'll figure it out. And in the meantime, Lawa, please send us a probe lens. We would love we would love it so much. Seriously, Google that. Like, after you listen to this episode, Google Lawa probe lens.
It's so weird, and I love it.
Be blown away by the weird wonderfulness of it. Anyway, thank you so much for listening and joining us on the show today. Send in your questions. We would be thrilled to turn them into an episode, and we will see you next time.
If you have questions or ideas for future episodes, you can email us at hello@photo-op.show.
Watch us on Ben's YouTube channel at NomCreative.
As in Om Nom Nom.
Share this with a friend, and you can listen to Photo Op anywhere podcasts are sold.
Or download it. 'Cause it's free.